Welcome. I'm Tracy Smith, and this is Here Comes the Sun, a closer look at some of the people, places, and things we bring you every weekend on Sunday morning. Michael Crichton, the perennial best-selling and quite prolific author, died in 2008. But when his widow Sherri began to comb through his office, she discovered an unfinished book. Unsure what to do with the manuscript, Sherri held on to it for years. That is, until she decided there was another renowned author who just might be the perfect person to finish what Crichton started. As she picked up the pieces of her life, she discovered and read parts of the volcano book he'd been working on, a page-turner about a massive eruption in Hawaii, worse than any in history. And then, did it just stop?
It abruptly, that's it. You come to the last page. But I kept thinking, there has to be more. There has to be more.
And so, after more than a decade, she decided it was time to finish it.
So then it was like, no, who's going to do that? And so I just went big. I thought, what about James Patterson?
Later in the show, James Patterson on his biggest challenge writing Eruption. What was the biggest challenge, would you say, in the process?
For me, it was, and it wasn't a problem once we get going, but can I keep this thing moving forward, the pace of it, and work the science in as well? That was, because I hadn't done that before. And I liked the challenge. I thought I could do it, but and you're not 100% until you actually, dive in the water and go, oh, I can swim with sharks, it's okay.
Then, from the fictional Hawaiian volcano in Eruption to real-life events that occurred there more than 300 years ago. British explorer Captain James Cook was the first European to discover Hawaii in the 1700s. Ben Tracy takes a look at the legacy he left behind.
As a kid, what were you taught about Cook?
He brought a lot of diseases. He brought a lot of problems to our society. He introduced westernization.
Is there a frustration that a lot of people almost think the history began here with Captain Cook?
Yes.
Captain Cook is a controversial figure, villain or hero, colonizer or trailblazer, depending on who is telling the story.
That's all coming up right here on Here Comes the Sun. Understandably, Michael Crichton's widow was apprehensive about allowing another author to complete his unfinished book, even if that author was literary legend James Patterson. I sat down with both Sherri Crichton and James Patterson to learn about how they worked together to complete those final pages. If you ever want to feel a sense of awe, try standing near an erupting volcano. The late author Michael Crichton was fascinated with volcanoes for most of his life. And even now, 16 years after his death, among the countless books and papers at his office in Santa Monica, you'll find stacks of volcano research. Oh, this is all volcanoes?
This is all volcanoes.
For his widow, Sherri Alexander Crichton, it's almost as if he's still here.
I feel his energy around all the time.
Do you ever talk to him?
I do.
You do?
I do. I always connect with him.
After he died, how long did it take for you to come here?
Wow. Pretty soon, pretty quickly. I couldn't not be where he was.
And in the mountain of papers he left behind, she found parts of an unfinished novel centered around a huge volcanic eruption.
This was the very, very early drafts.
It struck Sherri Crichton as something he would have wanted to share, a posthumous blockbuster from someone who, in his relatively short life, gave the world so much. In the literary world, Michael Crichton was a colossus, the only writer to have a #1 book, movie, and TV show in the same year. He was also a Harvard-educated doctor, a prolific genius who created scientific thrillers that brought millions along on heart-pounding rides, from big city emergency rooms in ER.
Busy downstairs?
Yeah, I gotta get back.
To the tornado-ravaged Heartland in Twister. To places that exist only in our dreams or our nightmares. Sherri Crichton remembers him as someone who was incredibly fun, but at times distant.
I remember when I first started dating Michael, a very dear friend of mine said, Sherri, it's going to go like this. It's going to feel like he doesn't want to have anything to do with you when he's writing. It's not going to feel like he loves you anymore because he's going to be into the book. And you're going to have to be okay with that. And I was like, of course I'll be okay. But when it hit, like that first few times when he would really separate, he was present, but he actually was still in his creation, whatever that was.
How'd you deal with that?
I had a hard time. I'm not gonna kid, it was hard. And it took a lot of self-confidence to be able to say to myself, this is gonna be okay. Let's give it another month. Let's see what it's gonna be like.
And it was okay. They married in 2005. But 3 years later, Michael Crichton died of cancer at age 66, leaving Sherri alone and 6 months pregnant with their son, John Michael. As she picked up the pieces of her life, she discovered and read parts of the volcano book he'd been working on, a page-turner about a massive eruption in Hawaii, worse than any in history. And then, did it just stop?
It abruptly, that's it. You come to the last page. But I kept thinking, there has to be more. There has to be more.
And so, after more than a decade, she decided it was time to finish it.
So then it was like, no, who's going to do that? And so I just went big. I thought, what about James Patterson? What about James Patterson?
James Patterson, you might have heard, is one of the most successful authors in history. He's sold something like 400 million books and collaborated with people like President Bill Clinton and the great Dolly Parton. Truth is, Patterson has a backlog of projects that keep him working every day, but when Sherri Crichton called, he answered. I can't imagine that you were looking for something to do.
I'm always looking for something to do.
Really, are you?
Sure, a little bit. I'm open to things to do, for sure.
And Crichton's story was too good for him to pass up about the big explosive volcano and the fact that it threatened to crack open a stockpile of toxic waste so potent that it could destroy life on planet Earth. But finishing the book was a tall order for both Patterson and Sherri Crichton.
How soon? You said you were apprehensive at first, that you were a little nervous.
Well, I was just nervous because it's a new relationship. And
she lives in Hollywood and people lie out here.
I have to say, I'm just fiercely protective of Michael's materials.
How did you find Michael Crichton's voice, or did you have to find his voice?
I had read everything that Michael Crichton wrote, so I think I had a sense of the voice. This book might be a little pacier than some of his books, just a little bit, but I had a feeling for it. I challenged people for them to come out and say, this is where Michael stopped and this is where James started. And I'm really proud of that. I'm really happy about it.
The end result, Eruption by Michael Crichton and James Patterson.
You know, there's a quote, I don't know where this comes from, and it's not me, but I love it, and it relates to my taking this project. And I think it's more valuable, actually, for 20-year-olds than it is for me. And the quote is, my time here is short. What can I do most beautifully? And I felt with Eruption and this Michael Crichton, I thought I could do it beautifully. I thought I could.
He's not wrong. The finished book is already said to have studios clamoring for the film rights. And it's also true to the spirit of the man who started it.
For people who just know him through his books, what was Michael Crichton like?
He was amazing. He was vulnerable and kind.
And now his work will live on in a team effort that's both highly anticipated and, to Sherri Crichton at least, worth waiting for.
I was single until the time I met Michael, and people used to go, why are you so picky? And I'm like, it's just not right yet. It's just not right. So I waited. And it was the same thing with Jim. It was the same thing. I waited on this manuscript until I felt that the time was right, that I had all the pieces of the puzzle, but then it had to be the right fit. And I think I did okay.
Up next, an exclusive excerpt from my chat with James Patterson and Sherri Crichton, something you can only see right here on Here Comes the Sun. Stay with us.
And it was very, very helpful in terms of making this book both incredibly entertaining and real.
As promised, here's more from my interview with James Patterson and Sherri Crichton. What did you know about Michael Crichton before all of this? Who is Michael Crichton?
Well, what I know about Michael Crichton is he's my favorite writer. I've read everything that Michael wrote, all of his novels and the nonfiction, travels, and I mean, he kind of invented this area where you take some great entertainment and you raise the genre. You make the genre better than it was. And he did it with just intelligence and just his knowledge of science. And that's an incredible art, to be able to tell a story you can't put down, and yet you learn so much while you're reading the story. You know, for me, I mean, Michener was always way too much information. I didn't want all that information, 90 pages on the seashells. And in this book, there's so much about volcanoes and Hawaii, and then this Black Death, this nuclear, and he knew about this stuff. He was obsessive about gathering information, and it was very, very helpful in terms of making this book both incredibly entertaining and real.
So you send this off to Jim to read, and what did you hear next?
We're in. We're in. And I'm like, really? We're in? It was very exciting. And I was a little bit, I'm going to be honest, I'm a little bit nervous. I've held this for 12 years. I've poured my heart and soul and free time into making sure that we have everything that we need. And I was like, okay, it's like, handing over the baby. I handed over the baby, and the baby was very well taken care of.
And the next piece of this was, okay, yes, I would like to do this, but then Sherri had to feel comfortable that, and that's why the outline that I had to do was important, because you read it and go like, okay, yeah, this is going to work. This is good. It's going to be a novel that potentially we're both going to be proud of.
What was the biggest challenge, would you say, in the process?
For me, it was, and it wasn't a problem once I get going, but can I keep this thing moving forward, the pace of it, and work the science in as well? That was, because I hadn't done that before, and I liked the challenge. I thought I could do it, but and you're not 100% until you actually, dive in the water and go, oh, I can swim with sharks. It's okay. That was the biggest challenge for me. Yeah, and also just the responsibility of, I want this to be a novel that Sherri goes, I'm really happy that we got together to do this thing. And she is, right, Sherri?
I very much am. I really, truly am.
As a Michael Crichton fan,
yeah,
what's it like to step back and see this, to see both of your names on the cover?
Oh, I think it's great. I'm so happy about it. I'm proud to be on the cover with Michael, and to have finished a book that I really feel very confident that people reading this will go like, yeah, this is one of Michael's bests. This is a good one. It's a good one.
Up next, the history of paradise. Welcome back. British explorer James Cook helped put places like Australia, New Zealand, and Hawaii on the map, literally. And while some historians claim he often had good relationships with the natives he encountered, his final voyage to what we now know as Hawaii was more complex. Ben Tracy explains.
On the big island of Hawaii, where the waves roll into Kealakekua Bay, a white obelisk 27 feet tall looms over the shoreline. It's a tribute to the great circumnavigator, Captain James Cook. It stands just feet from where he died.
I live right across from his monument, and I get up every morning and I see this. This is where they lived.
Akoni Palakat Nelson is a native Hawaiian, or Kanaka as they call themselves. He works for the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, advocating for the native people.
As a kid, what were you taught about Cook?
He brought a lot of diseases. He brought a lot of problems to our society. He introduced westernization.
Is there a frustration that a lot of people almost think the history began here with Captain Cook?
Yes.
Captain Cook is a controversial figure, villain or hero, colonizer or trailblazer, depending on who is telling the story. But what is not in dispute is that in the 1700s, the British explorer literally put much of what we now know as the Pacific Ocean on the map, creating detailed diagrams of the places he was the first European to discover, including New Zealand, Australia, the Cook Islands, which still bear his name, and the islands of Hawaii.
Whatever you think about Cook, he's certainly in the pantheon of the greatest explorers of all time. He gave us the contours of the Pacific Ocean.
Hampton Sides is author of the new book, The Wide, Wide Sea, documenting Cook's final and fateful voyage.
He had 3 voyages around the world. Each one was monumental. But the third voyage left England in July of 1776, just as the American Revolution was taking off.
What was this voyage supposed to be about? What were his marching orders from the Crown?
So Cook's third voyage was to go around the Cape of Good Hope and then to proceed to the west coast of North America and all the way up to Alaska in pursuit of the elusive, the fabled Northwest Passage.
So on his way to trying to find the Northwest Passage, he stumbles upon these islands out here in the Pacific. What was his reaction?
He couldn't believe that he had found these islands, first of all. They aren't on the maps. These aren't just little lowly atolls somewhere out there in the Pacific. These are massive volcanic islands with thousands and thousands of people living here, a whole thriving, flourishing civilization. He couldn't believe it. He was astounded. They were brought up here to this heiau, which is a sacred temple.
He showed us where Cook and his men came ashore on the Big Island, warmly welcomed by the native Hawaiians at this temple during a religious festival. Sides writes in his book that unlike many of his contemporary explorers, Cook took a genuine interest in the people he encountered. He treated them with respect, tried to prevent his men from spreading venereal disease, and made little attempt to convert them to Christianity.
And yet on his third and final voyage, something was wrong with Cook. He was mercurial, he was violent, he was cruel to the native people that he encountered as well. He just was losing it all the time near the end.
That end came when Cook and his men overstayed their welcome, attempting to hold the King of Hawaii ransom to get back a rowboat taken by the local people.
And it turned into a brawl and a melee, and things did not go well for Captain Cook.
Cook was killed on the shore of Kealakekua Bay on Valentine's Day, 1779.
Just across the bay there is where it all ended.
This is where he met his end.
And yet nearly 250 years later, Cook's story is still being told, revisited and revised as the age of imperialism has not aged so well. Statues of Cook have recently been toppled in Canada and Australia. His monument here in Hawaii defaced. Cook was the leading edge of what Pacific Islanders call the fatal impact and the death and loss of their culture that followed.
I get the fact that he has become a symbol of imperialism because he was the first. It's easy to just assign the blame on one person rather than all the people that came after him.
Yet here on the Big Island, you still find Cook's name on a post office, roadside stands, and an apartment complex. There's no simple break from this piece of the past.
Historically, what is this area?
So this is called Kawalumalie.
This National Historic Park is one of the last places on the Big Island that still looks like what Captain Cook and his crew would have seen centuries ago. It was known as a place of refuge, where if you broke a rule or a law, you could get a second chance. Keola Awong is Chief of Interpretation and Education.
But does this in some way feel like a place, too, that is a second chance of preserving this history? All this history that existed before the stuff in the history book?
Yeah, I would agree with that, yeah. So it's a second chance for us to get to tell our story, yeah, and tell it from our perspective.
She wants people to see Hawaii as more than a tourist attraction, more than white sands and scarlet sunsets, a place that existed long before it was discovered by a captain named Cook.
When most tourists come to Hawaii, do you get a sense that they know much about the history?
No, they don't know much about the true history. I think they see the history told by the Western point of view. Our culture is very much alive. Our culture carries on, it continues.
I'm Tracy Smith. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you here next time on Here Comes the Sun.